My name is Lenore. Before we begin, I need you to know that what I'm about to tell you isn't a story about revenge. It might sound like one, but it's not. It's about history, and how sometimes the quietest words from the past can shout down the loudest voices of the present. If you've ever felt like your work, your dedication, was being erased by someone who never bothered to understand it, then maybe you'll get what I'm about to say. It helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void here. The smell of old paper and lemon polish is the scent of my childhood. It's the smell of the Oakhaven building, the crown jewel of our city's historic downtown district. For 4 generations, my family, the Ashworths, have been its custodians. Not owners, not landlords, but protectors. My great-grandmother, Ilara Ashworth, founded our city's Historical Preservation Society. My grandfather expanded its charter. My father fought tooth and nail in the 80s to stop a mall from being built over the original cobblestone square. And me? I was the director of the society. It wasn't just a job. It was a birthright, a duty I'd been trained for since I could first read the faded brass plaques on the old lampposts. I loved my work. I loved the slow, meticulous process of restoration, the arguments over the precise shade of ochre for a building's trim, the hunt through dusty archives to find the original blueprints for a wrought iron gate. This was my world. It was a quiet world, a world of patience and reverence for what came before. Then Garth arrived. Garth Sterling wasn't just a developer. He was a brand. He was all sharp suits, sharper haircuts, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He talked about disruption and synergy and activating spaces. To him, our downtown wasn't a living museum. It was an under-monetized asset. When the news broke that his conglomerate Sterling Modern had bought the Oakhaven building, a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Oakhaven wasn't just another building. It was the anchor, the heart. Its grand oak doors and sweeping marble staircase set the tone for the entire district. His first week was a whirlwind of press conferences and glossy architectural renderings. He stood in front of Oakhaven, a place my father used to take me for ice cream on Sundays, and he spoke of turning it into a vertical campus of glass-walled offices and a rooftop bar with infinity pools. He used the word modernization like a weapon. My first and only meeting with him was on a Tuesday. He summoned me to the temporary office he'd set up on the ground floor. The air already smelled different, stripped of its familiar lemon polish and replaced with the sterile chemical scent of new carpets and whatever expensive cologne he was wearing. He didn't offer me a seat. He leaned against a stark white desk, holding a tablet. He said, "Lenore, I've been looking over the society's role, your role, and frankly, it's a bottleneck. A lot of red tape. We need to be agile, to move quickly." He swiped a finger across his screen. "So as part of our efforts to streamline the modernization of Oakhaven, and frankly this whole district, we're dissolving the society's direct oversight committee. Your position is being made redundant." Redundant. The word hung in the air, thick and insulting. 40 years of my life, a century of my family's legacy, dismissed in a single bloodless corporate term. He saw me as a bureaucratic obstacle, an old-fashioned gatekeeper standing in the way of his glorious glass and steel future. I remember the quiet heat that flushed up my neck, the way my knuckles went white where I gripped the strap of my bag. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that the red tape he so casually dismissed was the very fabric that held the district together, that every rule and regulation was a promise made to the future, paid for by the fights of the past. But I didn't. I just nodded. I looked him right in his cold, calculating eyes, and I said, "I see." He seemed pleased by my lack of argument. "Good," he said, with that empty smile. "I knew you'd be a professional about it. We'll have HR send you the paperwork. This is about progress, Lenore. Nothing personal." He had just taken a scalpel to my identity, to my family's entire history in this city, and called it nothing personal. He clearly hadn't done his research. He saw the Historical Preservation Society as a quaint, toothless organization, a civic hobby club. He saw me as its prim, easily discarded librarian. He'd looked at the building, the assets, the potential revenue. He had never once bothered to look at the foundation. He never bothered to read the fine print on the charter my great-grandmother had forged in iron and ink more than 80 years ago. Because buried in the city charter, an unbreakable covenant, tied to the deed of every single property in the historic district, was a clause my great-grandmother, Alara, had insisted upon. It was a fail-safe, a poison pill designed to stop a man exactly like Garth. The Ashworth Family Trust, which I now controlled, held a permanent and absolute architectural veto over any and all changes to the facades of every building in the entire district. He couldn't so much as change a window frame without my personal, written approval. He had fired the librarian, not realizing she was the only person with a key to the entire library. He thought he was streamlining his project. What he'd actually done was hand me the blueprints, the budget, the timeline, and a big red stamp that said NO, and he had absolutely no idea. As I walked out of Oakhaven for what he thought was the last time, past the oak doors he dreamed of replacing with revolving glass, I didn't feel defeated. I felt a cold, quiet clarity settle over me. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making him understand that history isn't something you erase. It's something you reckon with. The walk home was a blur of familiar ghosts. Every brick, every gas lamp, every carved stone lion guarding a set of steps was a testament to a battle my family had fought and won. I saw my father, his hair silvered by the time I was a teen, pointing out the unique bond of the brickwork on the old mercantile building, explaining how it was a style only used for a 5-year period after the Great Fire of 22. I could almost hear his voice, a low, gentle rumble, telling me, "See, Lenny, the story is right there. You just have to know how to read it." Now that story felt like it was ending, and I had failed to write the next chapter. The automatic, professional composure I'd maintained in Garth's presence shattered the moment I closed the door to my apartment. The silence was deafening. My home, usually a sanctuary filled with books on architectural history and framed maps of the city from different centuries, felt like a museum to a dead career. I sank onto my sofa, the leather cool against my skin, and the full weight of his words hit me. Redundant. A bottleneck. It was more than just being fired. It was an invalidation of my entire life's purpose. He hadn't just removed me from a position, he had attempted to erase my family's signature from the city itself. The first hour was a hollow ache. I just sat there, staring at the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun slanting through my window. The city hummed on outside, oblivious. Garth was probably already meeting with his architects, his team of disruptors, laughing about how easily they'd swept away the old guard. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twist in my gut. This wasn't just a corporate takeover, this was an execution. My mind started to spiral, replaying every sacrifice, every late night, every thankless task. I remembered the grant applications I'd written until my fingers cramped, securing funding to restore the stained glass in the old city library. I remembered spending a whole summer in the county archives, my hands covered in dust, cross-referencing deeds to prove the historical provenance of a horse trough that a different developer wanted to tear out for a parking space. We'd saved the trough. It was a tiny victory, insignificant to anyone else, but it was part of the story. It was a piece of the mosaic. Garth would have bulldozed it without a second thought and called it efficiency. I thought about my father. Towards the end of his life, he'd become obsessed with the district's preservation. He saw the slow creep of gentrification, the chipping away at the city's character. He'd sit at our dining room table, surrounded by maps and legal documents, his face etched with worry. He told me once, "They'll never stop coming for it, Lenny. The money men. They don't see beauty, they see empty space. Your job, our family's job, is to hold the line." And I had let the line break. The despair was a physical thing, a heavy blanket threatening to suffocate me. I got up and began to pace the confines of my apartment, a caged animal. I needed to do something, anything. I found myself in my small home office, a room I'd always loved, and my eyes landed on a row of worn, leather-bound journals on the highest shelf. My great-grandmother Alara's journals. I hadn't looked at them in years. My father had given them to me when I first took the director position, saying, "Everything you need to know is in here. Not just about the buildings, but about the fight." My hands trembled slightly as I took one down. It was dated 1934, and Eusochius. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a soft brown. Her handwriting was a revelation, not the delicate, looping script I'd imagined, but a strong, sharp, almost aggressive cursive. It was the handwriting of a woman who did not have time for nonsense. I opened to a random page. Her words leaped out at me, a voice from nearly a century ago speaking directly into the silent ruin of my afternoon. October 12, 1934. Mr. A. Bright, the banker with the face of a disgruntled bulldog, informed the committee today that our requests for historical designation were fiscally irresponsible. He speaks of progress as if it is a force of nature, a flood that must be allowed to wash away all that is old. He does not understand that progress without memory is just vandalism. He wants to tear down the Oakhaven for a new, modern hotel. He says it is what the city needs to look to the future. I told him the best way to look to the future is with a clear view of the past. I kept reading, turning page after page. Lara's fight against the bankers and developers of her day mirrored my own situation with an almost painful precision. They called her sentimental, an obstacle, a woman meddling in men's business. They underestimated her at every turn. But she was a strategist. She didn't just argue with passion. She armed herself with law, with public opinion, with the very structure of the city's governance. And then I found it. The entry that changed everything. June 2, 1935. A victory. But a quiet one. The city council has approved the formation of the historic district. They believe they have placated me with a title and a committee. They are fools. Mr. Albright and his ilk will not be held back by simple zoning. Men like that see laws as temporary inconveniences. So I have planted a seed in stone. I met with young Thomas Caldwell, the lawyer, a good man with a sharp mind. We have drafted a covenant, a permanent ward to be embedded within the charter itself. It ties the architectural integrity of every facade in the district, not to a committee, which can be disbanded, or a regulation which can be amended, but to a private trust. My trust. The Ashworth Trust. Let them come in 10 years, or 50, or 100. Let them buy the buildings and fire the committees. They will find my ghost waiting for them, pen in hand. They will find they cannot change a single brick without the blessing of my blood. A ghost waiting for them, pen in hand. A jolt went through me, so powerful it felt like an electric current. The despair, the hollow ache, it didn't just recede, it was burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that was as solid and unyielding as the granite foundation of the Oakhaven itself. Garth hadn't made my position redundant. He had made it essential. He had stripped me of the title of director, but in doing so, he had handed me the far more powerful, far more absolute title of judge. This was the catalyst. The moment the grief turned to steel. My father was wrong. The line hadn't broken. It had just been invisible. Garth had stumbled right over it in the dark, and now he was trapped on the wrong side. My focus narrowed. This was no longer about my lost job or my wounded pride. This was about honoring the promise Alara had made. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself, feeling the lie of it even as I formed the thought. It was about stewardship. It was about making Garth, and everyone like him, understand that some things are not for sale. My first call was to Arthur Pendleton. Arthur wasn't just my lawyer. He was a legacy in his own right. His grandfather, a stonemason named James, had worked on the restoration of Oakhaven's facade with my great-grandfather. His family's story was woven into the district just as tightly as mine. I knew he would understand. When I told him what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, in a voice as dry and steady as old parchment. Well, Lenore, the fool has fired the queen and left her in possession of the castle. What is our first move? The R was all I needed to hear. The battle had begun. The next morning, I walked not to my old office at the society, but to the discreet, oak-paneled law offices of Pendleton, Caldwell, and Croft. The Caldwell in the name was the grandson of the same Thomas Caldwell who had helped my great-grandmother draft the covenant. The firm's loyalty ran as deep as the city's foundations. Arthur Pendleton greeted me, not in a sterile conference room, but in his private study, a space that smelled of old books and brewed tea, a stark contrast to the chemical sterility of Garth's pop-up office. Arthur was a man who seemed to be carved from the same era as the buildings we were trying to protect. He was tall and lean, with a shock of white hair and eyes that held a quiet, fierce intelligence. He wore tweed. He always wore tweed. He had a file on his desk, a thick, worn leather-bound folder. The words Ashworth Trust were embossed in faded gold on the cover. He'd already pulled it from the firm's archives. He gestured to a comfortable chair opposite his desk and poured me a cup of tea without asking. He knew. He said, "I read Alara's journals once. Your father let me borrow them." She called it her poison pill, a rather dramatic turn of phrase, but in her case entirely accurate. I felt a surge of warmth. I wasn't alone in this. I wasn't some crazed, vengeful employee clinging to a technicality. I was the current executor of a long-term strategy. I said, "Garth has no idea. He thinks he's cleared the field." Arthur steepled his fingers, his expression one of calm, academic interest. That is his weakness. Men like Garth Sterling believe history begins the day they arrive. They see the past not as a foundation to be respected, but as a ruin to be cleared. He has mistaken your quiet competence for weakness. A common, and often fatal, error. He opened the folder. Inside, the documents were pristine, preserved in archival sleeves. The centerpiece was the original covenant, signed in 1935. The language was ironclad, a masterpiece of legal fortifications. It didn't just give the trust veto power, it specified it. Any alteration, modification, or deviation from the original architectural plans of the exterior facade, including but not limited to materials, fenestration, ornamentation, or entryway structures, requires the explicit, written, and personal consent of the acting trustee of the Ashworth Trust. It was breathtaking in its foresight. Alara hadn't just protected the buildings, she had protected them from the very mechanisms of modern development. A city council could be lobbied, a planning commission could be pressured, a public committee could be stacked or disbanded. But a private trust, that was a fortress. Arthur then told me something that solidified the bond between our families, a story I had only known in fragments. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. He said, "You know, Lenore, my loyalty to your family isn't just professional. My grandfather, James, was a master stonemason. In the Depression, he had his own small business. He was contracted by a developer, a man much like Garth, to do the stonework on a new bank. He put everything he had into it, hired extra men, bought the stone on credit. When the job was done, the developer declared bankruptcy on that specific project's shell corporation, a common trick even then, and refused to pay him. It would have ruined him, ruined our family." He paused, looking at a framed photo on his desk, of a proud-looking man in dusty overalls. My great-grandmother Alara heard about it. She wasn't a wealthy woman by the standards of the day, but she had influence. She went to the other merchants in the district, the ones who respected her, and organized a boycott of the bank that had hired the crooked developer. Then she used her own savings to pay my grandfather what he was owed, personally. She told him, "A man's craft is his name. We protect our own. That debt, Lenore, is not the kind that is ever truly repaid. It is honored. So when I say we will fight this, I am not just speaking as your legal counsel, I am speaking as James Pendleton's grandson." The story settled deep inside me, reinforcing the steel in my spine. This wasn't just my fight. It was Arthur's. It was for James the stonemason and Alara the strategist. This was the true meaning of the district. It wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a web of relationships, of debts honored and promises kept. Garth, with his transactional worldview, could never comprehend such a thing. Our plan began to take shape. It was a plan of silence and patience. The first rule Arthur insisted was to do nothing. Let him work. Let him spend his money. Let him hire the architects, commission the studies, draw up the plans. Let him announce his grand vision to the world. We will not fire a shot until he steps onto our battlefield. And our battlefield, he said with a thin smile, is the City Planning Commission's submission desk. So I waited. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. I watched from the sidelines as news reports celebrated Garth's vision for a revitalized downtown. I saw the glossy renderings in the newspaper, a sleek glass atrium gutting Oakhaven's grand entrance, a rooftop bar that looked like a spaceship had crash-landed on its historic slate roof. Each image was a fresh insult. Friends called offering condolences about my job. I just said, I'm taking some time to figure out my next steps. I didn't breathe a word about the veto. It was my secret weapon, and its power lay in the element of surprise. During this time, I dove deeper into the trust. With Arthur's help, I began to understand the full extent of my power. It wasn't just a simple yes or no. The covenant gave the trustee the right to review and approve materials, suppliers, and even the specific craftsmen if the work was deemed sufficiently critical to the historical character. Alara had left me not just a shield, but a sword, a whole arsenal. We began to prepare. We anticipated Garth's every move. When he realizes he's blocked, Arthur reasoned, his first step will be to try and invalidate the covenant. We hired a legal historian to prepare a defense of its legitimacy, tracking its uninterrupted legal standing for over 80 years. His second move will be to try and buy you out. We prepared a financial valuation of the veto's power, not as a cash asset, but as a controlling interest in the entire district's aesthetic future, something so priceless it couldn't have a number. His third move, when the first two fail, will be to try and destroy your reputation. To counter this, I reached out to my network, but not in the way you might think. I didn't ask for help. I just had conversations. I had coffee with the head of the state architectural board. Letter middoor to Idini need of to Babul de Arnand. I had lunch with a popular history professor at the local university. I spoke to journalists who specialized in cultural affairs. I didn't mention Garth or Oakhaven. I just talked about my family's legacy, about the importance of preservation, reinforcing my identity as a steward of the city's history. I was shoring up my defenses, reminding the world who I was before Garth tried to tell them. This wasn't about revenge, I kept telling myself as I filed away legal precedents and historical documents. This was about creating a fortress so strong that the very idea of an assault would seem ridiculous. I wasn't planning an attack. I was simply laying a siege. The beauty of it was that Garth was funding the entire operation. Every dollar he spent on his architects was a dollar wasted. Every press release he issued was another rope he was using to hang himself. He was building a magnificent house of cards, and I was just sitting quietly, holding the single card that would bring it all down. And I was waiting for him to play it. The waiting was a strange, suspended state of being. It lasted for 2 months. 2 months of watching Garth parade his vision for Oakhaven across local news and business journals. He was the city's new hero, the dynamic visionary who was dragging our sleepy town into the 21st century. I became a footnote in the story, the former director who had been streamlined out of the picture. In a way, it was perfect. The more invisible I became, the more powerful my eventual move would be. During this time, I did something my great-grandmother's journal inspired me to do. I started walking the district every single day. But now I wasn't just admiring the architecture. I was documenting it. I took thousands of high-resolution photographs of every building facade from every conceivable angle. I made notes on the state of every cornice, every window sash, every brick pointing. I was creating a comprehensive, unassailable record of the district as it stood, a baseline against which any proposed change could be measured. It felt like I was learning the city's language all over again, but this time, I was preparing to use it in a court of law. I also made a quiet visit to the city planning office. Not as Lenore Ashworth, former director, but as a private citizen. I reintroduced myself to a long-serving clerk named Margaret, a woman with a magnificent gray bun and an encyclopedic knowledge of the city's codes. I didn't mention Oakhaven. I simply asked her for a copy of the original 1935 city charter and all its addendums for a personal research project. Margaret gave me a knowing look over the top of her spectacles. She'd worked for the city for 40 years and had seen developers like Garth come and go. She said, "It's good to see you, Lenore. Some people think these old documents are just paper. But paper can be heavier than stone, can't it?" She was an ally I didn't even know I had. She made a copy of the covenant and stamped it with a gold seal, a quiet act of solidarity that meant the world to me. The day finally came. It arrived not with a bang, but with a bland email notification from the city's public planning portal. A new major project application had been filed for the Oakhaven building. It was from Sterling Modern. The plans were public. I downloaded the file. It was worse than the renderings. It was a 200-page document of architectural hubris. They weren't just adding a glass atrium. They were tearing out the entire grand stone archway of the entrance. The iconic hand-carved oak doors were to be replaced with a sterile, revolving glass tube. The beautiful, multi-paned casement windows were to be ripped out and replaced with floor-to-ceiling sheets of non-reflective glass. It wasn't a renovation. It was a desecration. He was peeling the face off the building and replacing it with his own empty, modern mask. I spent the rest of the day with Arthur, cross-referencing every proposed change with the clauses in the covenant and my photographic record. It was a slam dunk. Every single modification to the facade was a flagrant violation. The next morning, I typed a one-page letter. It was simple, professional, and utterly devastating. It was addressed to Garth Sterling, with copies sent to the head of the City Planning Commission and the legal department. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Sterling, this letter is in reference to the project application submitted on this date for the property known as the Oakhaven Building. Please be advised that pursuant to the legally binding and permanent covenant established in the City Charter of 1935, the Ashworth Trust holds absolute architectural veto power over all exterior facades within the designated historic downtown district. The Trust has reviewed the 200-page proposal submitted by Sterling Modern. We find that the proposed alterations to the building's entrance, fenestration, and material composition are in direct violation of the preservation standards outlined in the covenant. Therefore, acting as the sole trustee of the Ashworth Trust, I am exercising our right of veto. The plan as submitted is rejected in its entirety. Any future plans for the Oakhaven building or any other building within the district must be submitted to me directly for personal review and written approval prior to their submission to the city. Please note that this includes any change, no matter how minor, to any window frame, door, or piece of exterior masonry. Sincerely, Lenore Ashworth, Trustee. The Ashworth Trust. I didn't use a law firm's letterhead. I used my own personal stationery. I wanted him to know this wasn't coming from a faceless legal team. It was coming from me, the woman he had dismissed. The bottleneck. I signed it, sealed the envelope, and sent it via a bonded courier with signature required. The first move had been made. It was quiet. It was precise. And it was aimed directly at the heart of his project. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. My insider, Margaret from the planning office, called me that afternoon. She sounded like she was trying very hard not to laugh. She said, "Lenore, you've thrown a grenade into the hornet's nest. You've thrown a grenade into the hornet's nest. Mr. Sterling is here. He's in the commissioner's office. I can hear him shouting through the door. He keeps saying the words impossible and ambush." The image was so satisfying, it was almost a physical pleasure. Garth, the man of cool control, of effortless dominance, shouting. He had hit the wall, the invisible 80-year-old wall my great-grandmother had built, and he had no idea what it was made of. His first official response came 2 days later, via a letter from a team of high-priced lawyers from a firm I'd never heard of. It was full of bluster and threats. It called the Covenant an archaic and unenforceable relic, and accused me of tortious interference with his business. It was a transparent attempt to intimidate me, to bully me into backing down. I forwarded it to Arthur. His response was a one-sentence email. "They're squealing. It's a good sign." Our counter-response was calm and clinical. Arthur sent them a package containing the legal historian's report, a record of the Covenant's uninterrupted legal standing, and precedents from 3 other cities where similar historical covenants had been upheld in court. We didn't argue, we just presented the facts. We showed them the stone wall they were trying to punch through was, in fact, made of solid legal granite. The legal threats stopped. The silence that followed was even more telling. Garth was realizing that he couldn't bully his way through this. The covenant was real. The veto was absolute. I had him. His next move was exactly what Arthur had predicted. He tried to buy me. He called my personal cell phone. His voice was entirely different. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a strained, artificial friendliness. "Lenore," he said, like we were old friends. "Garth Sterling. I think we got off on the wrong foot. There's been a misunderstanding. This whole veto thing, it's a bit of a surprise, but I'm a reasonable man. I'm sure we can come to a financial arrangement that works for everyone." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I replied. "Mr. Sterling, I am not for sale, and neither is the history of this city." I could almost hear him grinding his teeth. "Look," he said, his voice tightening, "every problem has a number. Name yours. I want to put this behind us and get on with the project." "It's not a problem, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice calm and even. "It's a feature. The preservation of the district is the entire point. There is no number." He started to lose his composure. He talked about the money he had already sunk into the project, the investors, the timeline. He was pleading, but it was the pleading of a bully who can't understand why his victim won't just stay down. I listened patiently. When he was finished, I simply said, "You should have done your research. The veto is not a negotiating tool. It is a fact. Submit a new plan, a respectful plan, or don't. The choice is yours." Then I hung up.
A formal offer arrived by email an hour later, this time from Everett himself. It was a masterpiece of panicked capitulation. He offered me my job back, with the new title of Chief Technology Officer. He offered me a salary that was triple my old one. He offered me a corner office, a massive bonus, and stock options that would have made me a millionaire on paper. He wrote about misunderstandings and restructuring missteps. He said he had always valued my contributions. I read the email twice, a cold, clinical smile on my face. A week ago, this offer would have been a dream come true. Now it was an insult. He wasn't offering me power. He was trying to buy my silence. He was trying to put his ghost back in the machine. He still didn't understand. I didn't want a seat at his table. I was building my own. I forwarded his email to my lawyer with a single line, "Please handle this." Her reply was almost instantaneous. With pleasure, she sent back a formal rejection of his offer on Phoenix Engineering letterhead. It was polite, professional, and utterly brutal. It stated that I was fully committed to the success of my own firm and was not available for outside employment. It then, as a professional courtesy, attached a copy of our standard master services agreement and a schedule of our consulting fees. should Innovate Dynamics wish to engage our services to solve their ongoing technical challenges. Putting the contract in front of him was the real checkmate. He had tried to offer me a job. I was offering to sell him a solution. It was a fundamental power shift. He was no longer my boss. He was a potential client, a very desperate, very flammable client. The silent takeover was nearly complete. The choice was let his company burn to the ground, or pay the woman he had erased to come back and put out the fire. The call came from their general counsel. His name was Arthur, a man with a tired, gravelly voice who sounded like he'd rather be anywhere else. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He said, "Miss Vance, we have received your firm's proposal. The terms are unconventional." I stayed silent. The first person to speak loses. That's a rule in negotiation, and it's a rule in physics. Vacuums get filled. I let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on his end of the line. Finally he sighed. A deep, defeated sound. He said, "Everett Vance and the board have authorized us to engage Phoenix Engineering Solutions to resolve the issue. We accept your terms. All of them. All of them." That included the 7-figure upfront fee for the diagnostic. It included the ongoing percentage of all future royalties from the Prometheus patent. And it included the public acknowledgement of my role as the technology's principal architect. He had tried to erase my name, and now he was legally obligated to carve it in stone. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the integrity of the historical record. The final confrontation wasn't in a sterile boardroom. It was in the lab. My lab. Arthur had insisted on a neutral site, but I refused. I told him the work had to be done on site, with direct access to the core hardware. It was a power play, and he knew it, but he had no cards left to play. I walked through the doors of Innovate Dynamics for the first time since I'd been fired. The security guard at the front desk, a friendly guy named Sal, just nodded at me. He didn't need to see a badge. The entire company knew who I was now. I walked down the hallways, and people averted their eyes. The air of celebration was gone, replaced by a thick, anxious gloom. It was a company holding its breath. The lab was exactly as I had left it, only now it felt like an archaeological site. Marcus was with me, not as a junior engineer, but as my colleague. He carried a single matte black laptop case. My new laptop. Everett was there. He was standing by the main diagnostic console, looking smaller than I remembered. His expensive suit was rumpled. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. The swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle, hollowed-out look. Arthur, the lawyer, stood beside him, looking grim. Everett didn't look at me. He stared at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at me. I walked over to the console, the familiar hum of the equipment, a welcome sound. I didn't say hello. I just got to work. I opened my laptop and connected it to their system. Marcus stood behind me, a silent, imposing presence. I typed for a few minutes, navigating through firewalls and security protocols that felt like old, familiar pathways. They hadn't even bothered to change my administrative access. A rookie mistake. I brought up the core firmware file. I showed Arthur the section of code, the part that was disguised as a data integrity routine. I said, "The flaw is here. It's a recursive loop that triggers a throttle on the power cell's output after 100 hours of continuous uptime. It can only be deactivated by a specific reset key." Arthur squinted at the screen, not understanding a word of it, but understanding the finality in my tone. Everett finally spoke. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Why?" I stopped typing, but I didn't turn to look at him. I stared at the screen, at the lines of code that represented 2 years of my life. I thought about his golf trips, the condescending pats on the head, the stolen credit, the word workhorse. I thought about the cold, impersonal email that had tried to turn me into a footnote. I finally turned my head and met his gaze. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of the board, or the stock price, or the angry customers. It was the fear of a man who has just realized he picked a fight with someone whose weapons he can't even comprehend. I thought about all the things I could say. I could have screamed at him. I could have listed every single one of his betrayals. But that would have been his language. Noise. Bluster.
The power had shifted. It was a quiet, seismic event that no one outside of a small circle of people knew had even happened. But I felt it. The weight was no longer on my shoulders. It was on his. The next phase of his desperation was public. He tried to pressure me through the media, giving an interview to the city's business journal, where he lamented the unforeseen bureaucratic hurdles and anti-progress forces holding up the Oakhaven revitalization. He painted me as an embittered obstructionist zealot, a lone holdout standing in the way of jobs and prosperity. But the groundwork I had laid paid off. The journalist who wrote the story also interviewed the head of the State Architectural Board, who praised my unimpeachable record as a dedicated preservationist. He interviewed the history professor, who spoke eloquently about the national significance of our downtown district. The story that emerged wasn't of a visionary developer being thwarted by a bitter ex-employee. It was of a city's respected guardian holding a powerful outsider accountable to the rules. Then, something wonderful happened. The client exodus that I hadn't even planned for began. The owners of the other historic buildings in the district started to rally. A man named Mr. Chen, who owned the old mercantile building, called me. He said, "Lenore, we all saw what Sterling did to you, and we see what he wants to do to Oakhaven. Thank you for standing up to him. You have our full support." He was followed by others. The woman who ran the old-fashioned bakery on the corner, the family that owned the Rialto Theater. They saw Garth's plan for Oakhaven and realized their own buildings could be next. They saw my veto not as an obstacle, but as a shield for the entire district. We formed an informal alliance. When Garth's representatives came sniffing around, trying to get them to publicly support him or to put pressure on me, they were met with a unified, polite, and unbreachable wall of refusal. He thought he was fighting one woman. He was now fighting the collective will of the entire district, and I was their champion. Garth's desperate countermoves became more frantic. He tried to get a city councilman to introduce a motion to have the covenant legally challenged by the city itself, but Arthur and I were ready. We had already met with the city's legal team and walked them through the airtight nature of the trust. The city's lawyers advised the council that challenging the covenant would be a costly, unwinnable lawsuit that would expose the city to significant liability. The motion died before it even reached the floor. He was trapped. Every avenue was a dead end. Every strategy he deployed was one we had anticipated and prepared for. The beautiful, streamlined project was now a financial quagmire. His investors were getting nervous. The daily cost of the stalled project was bleeding him dry. The noise of his bluster and panic was echoing through the city's financial world, while I remained in my quiet, calm fortress of legal and moral authority. He had no more moves to make, except one. He had to come to me. The meeting was on my terms, not in an office, not in a boardroom, but at a small, unassuming table at the back of the corner bakery in the heart of the district. The air smelled of sugar and baking bread, the antithesis of everything Garth Sterling represented. He arrived looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His expensive suit was rumpled, his sharp haircut looked slightly deflated, and the smile was completely gone, replaced by a deep-set weariness. He was a general who had lost the war and was there to discuss the terms of surrender. I was already seated, a cup of tea in my hands. I didn't stand up when he arrived. I just gestured to the chair opposite me. He sat down heavily. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He just said, "What do you want, Lenore?" It was the question I had been waiting for, the question my entire life, my entire family's legacy, had prepared me to answer. I took a slow sip of my tea. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about my ego. I kept telling myself that. This was about the work, It was about ensuring the district's soul would be protected, not just now, but for generations to come. I said, I want Oakhaven to be restored, not modernized. Restored. I want its history honored, not erased. He scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. That's not profitable. My investors. Your investors are your problem. I interrupted, my voice still quiet, still calm. You bought a historic landmark. You made a bad investment because you failed to do your due diligence. That is not my concern. He slumped in his chair, the fight finally draining out of him. He looked out the window at the brick facade of the building across the street. So what's the play? You just veto every plan forever. Let the building rot while we both bleed money. No, I said. That's not the play. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table. He looked at it. It was a one-page agreement. It was simple and direct. It proposed the creation of a new, independent nonprofit foundation, the Oakhaven Restoration Foundation. The foundation's sole purpose would be to oversee the complete and historically accurate restoration of the Oakhaven building. It would have final say on all plans, materials, and contractors. The director of that foundation, the agreement stated, would be me. And how is this foundation funded? He asked, his voice hoarse. I pointed to a clause on the page. Sterling Modern will provide the full initial capital for the restoration, as per your original investment budget. In return, once the restoration is complete and the building is leased, your company will receive a minority percentage of the net rental income. The majority will go to the foundation to fund its ongoing work, the preservation of the rest of the district, in perpetuity. He stared at the paper, then at me. His face was a mask of disbelief. You want me to pay for you to take over my own project? To turn my flagship investment into your personal hobby? I looked him right in the eye. No, Garth. I want you to fulfill the promise of your investment. You promised the city a world-class building. I'm going to give them one. You'll get a return, a smaller one than you hoped for, but an honest one. Or you can walk away, declare a total loss, and explain to your investors how you managed to buy the most important building in the city without reading the deed. He knew he was beaten. Checkmate. His entire grand vision, his reputation as a master developer, was hanging by the thread of my signature. He had tried to streamline the process by firing me. Now I was the only process left. He sat there for a long time, the sounds of the bakery filling the silence between us. Finally, he picked up the pen I had placed on the table and signed the agreement. He didn't say another word. He just stood up and walked out, leaving the signed paper on the table. As I watched him go, a thought came to me, clear as a bell. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about restoring a sense of order to a world he had tried to throw into chaos. He had come to our city with noise and arrogance, and a lust for erasure. He was leaving in silence, having been forced to become a patron of the very thing he had tried to destroy. I had not only protected my family's legacy, I had made him pay for its future. The ghost of Alara Ashworth could finally rest easy. Her fortress had held. So, what's the moral of this story? It's not as simple as the little guy won. In the end, it was never about me versus Garth. It was about two different ways of seeing the world. He saw a city as a collection of assets on a balance sheet, spaces to be activated and monetized. I see a city as a story, a living text written in brick and stone and cobblestone, a story that we have a sacred duty to read, to preserve, and to pass on. He thought he could fire me from my job, but he failed to understand that what I do isn't a job, it's an identity. It's a promise passed down through generations. He couldn't fire me from being an Ashworth, and that was the one title that actually mattered. My power wasn't derived from a corporate flowchart. It was rooted in my great-grandmother's foresight, in my father's teachings, in my own deep, unshakable love for the history of this place. Today I'm standing in the grand lobby of the Oakhaven building. The restoration is almost complete. The original oak doors have been recarved and rehung. The marble floors gleam. Sunlight streams through the newly restored casement windows, catching the dust motes in the air, and for the first time in a long time, the air smells of old paper and lemon polish. It smells like home. My new office is on the second floor, overlooking the historic square. The plaque on the door doesn't say Director of the Historical Preservation Society. It says Lenore Ashworth, Trustee, the Oakhaven Restoration Foundation. I didn't destroy Garth. The consequences of his own arrogance did that. He tried to take a shortcut, and he fell off a cliff that had been marked on the map for 80 years. He just never bothered to read the map. So I'm sharing this story for anyone out there who feels like they're being overlooked, underestimated, or erased. For anyone who has poured their heart and soul into their work, only to have someone in a sharp suit call it a bottleneck. Your value is not determined by their inability to see it. Your strength doesn't come from a title they can give you or take away. It comes from your knowledge, your dedication, your integrity. It comes from the foundations you've built, stone by quiet stone, over the years. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your work doesn't matter. Sometimes the quietest, most diligent work is the very thing that holds the whole structure together. They may not see the foundation, but they will find out very quickly what happens when they try to build without it. Remember that. Your worth is inherent, it is non-negotiable,